Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Blue Post Podcast. I'm your host, Anthony Fusco. This podcast episode is part of a series that's going to be focusing on Wellness and Mobility Month presented by Bell Let's Talk. Today, I'd like to welcome for the first time to the Blue Post Podcast, my guest today, Dr. Friesen. Dr. Friesen, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Before we get into everything, how have the holidays been treating you so far?
So far, so good. Thanks for having me on the show here. I've taken 2 weeks off, and it's actually nice to do nothing for a while.
Yeah, no, I can completely understand that. It's nice around this time, and especially with everything going on, to take a little bit of time and recharge our batteries. And I'm sure we're going to get into that a little bit later on too. But can you tell myself and everybody listening in a little bit about yourself and how you found yourself in this field?
Yeah, so I'm a licensed clinical forensic and neuropsychologist here in Ontario. We were talking earlier, but the idea of a sports psychologist is not a licensed profession in Ontario, but there are certifications you can get. And so I'm, by any stretch of the imagination, I'm a sport and performance psychologist within Canada. I played hockey as a goalie in Toronto in the 80s and 90s, and I was always into sports. There's no real good sports psychology programs in Canada, at least when I was going through schooling. And so you had to become a licensed psychologist first, which I still practice. About half of what I do is still neuropsychology and clinical psychology. I work with police forces, Hamilton and Niagara. And I've always been interested in success. And when I was a teenager, reading Tony Robbins and The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, these things really, I wish I actually read them before, earlier in my hockey career, but I didn't, unfortunately. And anyone who plays hockey knowing this, goalies were a strange bunch, and there's a lot of superstitions and a big mental side of it. So I've always been interested in that. And the last 10 years or so, I've been working a lot more with high-level athletes and others as well, like entrepreneurs and executives, things like this, to try and help them achieve their potential, essentially.
So what would make a high-level athlete seek you out for help?
There's a number of common themes that come up with athletes that contact me. Often it's performance anxiety. Just underperforming, getting nervous for, let's say in hockey, it would be more like tryouts or a new team or this kind of thing. The other sports that are, let's say like Olympic wrestling, for example, or mixed martial arts, these athletes tend to get a lot of that performance anxiety whenever they compete. But once you're, for example, in hockey, once you're playing, you often, because you're playing so often, you don't get that doesn't happen as much. But a lot of slumps, people go through slumps, and that, brings them to me. Occasionally it's motivation issues. They're having trouble staying motivated. Now during COVID-19, we are finding, a lot of athletes are having a hard time staying motivated to train. A lot of athletes get injured as well, and then staying mentally strong during their injuries. But there's a lot of athletes I see that have just problems even off the court, off the ice, where they find it difficult to manage relationships, or they have depression, anxiety, panic attacks, this kind of thing.
Do you see anything more common? Is it like, out of all of those things that you listed there, is there one thing that comes up more commonly than another? Is motivation the biggest thing? Is it injuries? Is it off the ice, off the court? What do you see most commonly?
Definitely the most common thing is performance anxiety. This is, negative emotions, especially anxiety, is the number one motivator for humans and animals. Fear motivates us very well. And when we're feeling anxious, this brings people to start searching for someone to help them get out of this. Often coaches, refer them to me. But this is it. It's usually performance anxiety of some sort. They do really well in practice. And then they get on to, during an actual competition or during a game or a tryout, and the performance drops. And the only difference, if it's not nutrition, it's not because they're out of shape. It's, we kind of finally whittle it down to figuring out it's usually the mental side of things that's occurring.
That's a perfect segue into my next question, which is, what does mental and physical health mean to you personally?
There's a lot of aspects to this. I really think that for us to perform at our best, first of all, we can't be, well, it's difficult if we have a lot of mental health difficulties that are getting into that clinical realm of depression, too much anxiety, generalized worry, poor sleep. But optimal mental and performance health and mental health to me is different areas. First of all, your sleep is optimized. Your physical activity, of course, your physical body is optimized. Measuring things like heart rate variability to determine whether you're overtrained or not is really important. So these are, of course, your nutrition as well. And there's a saying that basically exercise is equivalent to taking Prozac and Ritalin. So Prozac's an antidepressant, so it improves your mood, and Ritalin's an well, it's used for ADHD medication, so it helps people focus and this kind of thing. And having a clear understanding of your goals and values is extremely important, because essentially the biggest issue I see with athletes is with anybody when it comes to success is, basically success, I would define success as being able to get yourself to do things even though you don't feel like doing them or you're afraid to do them. And this usually comes from knowing our goals and values, knowing who we are and what's important to us, and then doing, living our lives congruent with that, despite how we feel, despite what our mind says we can and cannot do, and this sort of thing. I also, because I'm a neuropsychologist, which is a type of psychologist that specializes in the brain, I really think that brain health is extremely important. So you have to have your neurology on board, your physiology on board, and your psychology on board. And I think when you have all those things, you're going to function the way you want to function. And it's extremely important to think of it that way as well, not just think of it as one thing. Feeling happy is not the best. It's too singular to think of it that way.
No, that's a fantastic answer. And I want to go back to some of your work with athletes now. So if you're working with an athlete for the very first time, maybe they're a little bit more guarded. They really don't know what to expect at this point. How do you get them to open up and be vulnerable to you?
That's a great question. There's individual differences in terms of how open athletes are with me and with any mental health professional or sports psychologist. The most important thing from my side of it is having a non-judgmental, empathic, accepting attitude towards what they're experiencing. Nobody likes to feel judged. Actually, in sports, this is commonly how coaches and coaching is done. People, they basically point out everything you're doing wrong, and there's often a feeling of being judged by the media, by fans, by parents, by teammates, by coaches. And this, when it comes to being able to open up, as soon as you feel judged, we feel defensive. We don't want to open up. So being accepting, understanding, and listening to them and what they're experiencing is the number one and the most important thing. That's a necessary but not sufficient part of change. So you have to feel safe and be able to open up, but then only then will you be open to strategies to potentially help you improve.
And are the issues different between maybe a male athlete and a female athlete, or is it the same all through the spectrum?
In my experience, I would say for the most part, it's the same. It's very, very similar. Different sports have different issues. Some sports are more social, and some of the sports with more women and females, they can have more issues with interpersonal issues, at least in my experience working with athletes. But most of the difficulties are pretty much the same. There's a little bit higher prevalence in my experience with eating disorders with female athletes in particular types of sports like gymnastics, figure skating, this kind of thing.
And just going off of that, what about issues that maybe younger athletes would face compared to older athletes? Are they different, the same? What do you think?
And when you say younger, are you meaning like 10-year-olds versus 20-year-olds, or are you thinking like 50-year-olds?
You know what? If you can answer between 10 and 20 and 20 and 50, that'd be fantastic.
Sure. Okay. With younger kids, I'll be honest. For the most part, if someone's under 10 and their parents are bringing them in for peak performance work, I usually don't like that. I feel like at that point in one's development, a kid's development, they don't need that extra pressure. They should be playing for the fun of the game. And I know AAA hockey and this sort of thing, it gets competitive very fast.
Yes.
But this concerns me because some kids are pushed into sports very early. Think of gymnastics and even hockey in high levels, and there's a lot of pressure on these little kids, and it's not always good for them. So often the parents will bring little kids in because they're just not performing well, and they don't know why. They seem to be fine, for example, at school, and it's just like on the ice or whatever it may be, they're not performing like they do in practice. This is usually the number one sign, the way you play in practice versus on the ice in an actual game, when there's a big discrepancy there. So these kids sometimes have motivation issues because, they're being told they have to do this, as opposed to it's always not always coming from within. When you get to athletes who are, like 17, 18, 19, 20, this, like in hockey, this is the transition time. This is the time you're either going to make it or you're not. And so, for most of them. And so this is a time when athletes at that age, let's say hockey players, for example, they'll come to see me because they really, really want to make it, and they want to make sure they've done all these other things, like they have a personal trainer and they're mastering their nutrition, etc. But their mental game is they know they've never really done any work on that, so they're usually coming in for that, and it's usually performance anxiety at that point. Older athletes, when it gets to older athletes, it's very rare does an older athlete come to see a sports psychologist. In my experience, it's usually golfers, and they want to improve their golf game, and they know it's mental. And these are guys who tend to, they're competitive, and sometimes they get too competitive. Let's say with golf, but I rarely see a beer league or a men's league hockey player who's 30 or 40 years old coming to see me, because it has happened, but it's rare, and it's usually it's just, again, there's that motivation isn't there, because unless there's that negative emotion, for example, that anxiety, or this fear of letting people down, it doesn't drive you towards seeking help. And when you come to see a sports psychologist, it takes some work, right? It's not just talking for an hour. There's usually homework, things to work on between sessions to help improve. Just like any skill, you have to work on it to get better at it.
And does the level of sport as well come into play with you? Would you be giving the same kind of answer to an NHL player coming to you as opposed to maybe a 16-year-old AAA player? Does the same thing kind of apply?
Often it's similar. The higher level athletes, the elite and pro athletes, they tend to have issues with consistency of performance, and that's their concern. So slumps. So that's usually a bigger concern with professional athletes. And then when you get higher up there, there's a lot more scrutiny. I mean, anyone who makes it to the NHL has probably had a decent amount of scrutiny in terms of coaches and fans and people like this knowing who they are. You have to be pretty good, to get there. And so you're probably one of the best on your team all the way through all of your hockey career. But you get under much more of a microscope when you get to the pros, and that can be difficult for some people, and difficult to even just think of social media, getting people saying negative things about you on social media, but not just that, color commentators making comments. There's lots of talk radio on hockey talk radio, for example, where they say some things that are difficult to hear, and sometimes it's not even accurate. And so this can be really difficult to compartmentalize and be able to, sometimes I try to teach them to be able to notice and what they're hearing from these people. Is there anything I can use from this to make myself better? Or, even if it's a motivation to prove them wrong, but if it's dragging you down, maybe this isn't a good use of your time to focus on this sort of thing. So those are kind of the bigger issues I tend to see.
And actually, it's a beautiful segue into the next question. So you talked about maybe some of the comments that are made, motivation to get better. So are there different kind of ways to promote positivity with an athlete that you're working with?
Yeah, so there's a lot of myths in my mind, myths out there in terms of positive thinking and thinking you should think you're the best, have unshakable confidence, and always think positive. And the human brain doesn't work that way, as we all know. But when we hear this, we all think that there's something wrong with us individually. And if the athletes all feel this as well. They think I should be thinking I'm the best and have no doubts in in terms of how well I'm going to perform, etc. But the reality is, you don't actually want super high confidence. And I usually give an example to the athletes I work with. And I say, look, let's say you had a twin brother who also played hockey, just as good as you, exact same talent. And you could both have a tryout coming out in let's say in 3 months. And, you have doubts, self-doubt. So your confidence isn't perfect, but your brother has perfect confidence. Who's going to get up at 5 a.m. to do more training? The person who already knows he's got it, or the person who doesn't? And you can go on and ask 100 questions like this. And it helps the athlete realize that self-doubt is their friend. Having full confidence isn't good. Having confidence that if I work hard enough, I can be the best is different than I am the best. And so this is something that I think is really important to help athletes differentiate. Is it's not all about having pure confidence. The other thing is, if you just walk around and say positive, they call them affirmations, saying, I'm going to get a hat trick tonight. I'm going to have a shutout tonight. This sort of thing. These things don't tend to work. There's research on this. It just doesn't tend to work. It's better to, again, focus on what you can control, because let's say a goalie having a shutout, you don't have full control over that. It's a guy could pass it across the ice and the guy has a complete open net. He does a one-timer. 1 in 100 times you may dive and you'll tip the end of your stick, and you might stop it. But the rest of the time it's physics. It's impossible. So to have that, thinking like that is just setting you up for failure, because eventually they're going to score a goal. And once that goal goes in your mind, you were thinking I should get a shutout, you're screwed. Essentially, you're going to have a hard time coming back from that. Instead, imagining what you can do, is what you would do in each different scenario that can come up. What's the best thing I could do? Even if they score 3 goals in a row on me, what can I do? How do I envision myself handling that? So I think thinking more realistically and planning what you can do in different scenarios is more important than trying to think positive.
No, that's absolutely one. I'm kind of blown away by that answer, because it so much relates just to athletes, to everything, even just to me. And that is kind of my segue into the next question, which is just talking about the average person, just Anthony right now, the average Joe. I'm not an amateur athlete. I'm not a pro. Both of those passed me by a long time ago. I'm not going back there. But what is something that just myself or anybody else listening to this can do, either physically or mentally, maybe at the start of the day, to be put into a good mindset for the rest of the day?
I think setting aside some time every morning, whether it's when you're lying in bed after your alarm goes off. Some people that's hard to do. The brain isn't quite online at that point. But having a little, could be just 5 minutes where it's quiet, whether it's in the shower or wherever this will be, and envisioning how you want your day to go. And again, I don't mean like just everything's sailing by perfectly, but really thinking about, what do I want to accomplish today? Who do I want to be? What do I want to represent? In other words, these are, again, your goals and values, because we really want our goals and values to dictate what we do with our lives, not our moods, not the weather, not what social media says, not what our own mind says we can and cannot do. We want our decisions about what to do, what to focus on based on our goals and values. So really identifying that and thinking, okay, and having it written down. I have them written down on my phone, for example. I tell the people I work with the same thing, the athletes, say, have this written down, usually in your phone in the notes section. And it's like, what kind of hockey player do I want to be? Or what kind of sportscaster do I want to be? And, and these are your values and goals, and really bringing that to the forefront. Have you ever had that experience where, I don't know, you decide you want to buy a Tesla, and you're like, all of a sudden you start to see them everywhere, because your friend got a Tesla and you're like, oh my gosh, that looks amazing. And you just see them everywhere. And it's not that they've increased in the last 24 hours in terms of their, the number of people bought a Tesla and they happen to drive by you, is that your brain is primed to notice the Tesla because you've been thinking about it. Because there's tons of information that's coming into our senses all the time. Our brain does most of its job is to filter things out that are not relevant and that are not congruent to how we think, feel, or what we're looking for. And so when you kind of think through the day in terms of what you want to, who you want to be, what you want to accomplish. And this can help, guide you towards, these things. You're going to notice things that confirm this and ignore things that don't confirm this, don't bring you towards those goals or values. So I think that's probably the best way to start your day.
That's fantastic. This has been an incredible interview, and I don't want to take up all your time, but I do have one final question for you.
Sure.
And I've been asking everybody this one. I think it's been very interesting because everybody's had a different answer. So I'm expecting something great here, but and I think it's going to be great as well. I'm going to preface that right now. But can you tell me what is the most rewarding part of your job, and what would the hardest part of your job be? A bit of a two-part question.
Yeah. So the most rewarding part of my job is working with, I define it as high achievers. So whether they're athletes or not, with people who have goals and they're trying to improve themselves, and they accomplish the goals that they're seeking to set out. That's the most rewarding thing for me. Although when I work with clinical patients who have severe problems with, let's say, depression or anxiety, who are able to overcome these and go back to the life they actually want to live. Those are the most rewarding parts of my job. There's a lot of potential difficult parts of my job. One of my jobs is to evaluate new police officers coming in through Niagara and Hamilton, and determining who is suitable and who is not, from a mental health perspective and from just a personality perspective. And some of these individuals, these younger guys and gals, they go to school, do their criminology degree, they do their police foundations, they do all this stuff, they volunteer, and some of them are just not suitable. I have to make that call for the safety of the public. It's also in the applicant's best interest. But that makes me sad. I don't like doing it, but I have to do it. And it's it's kind of squashing someone's dreams, but at the same time, it wasn't the right dream for them, unfortunately. Just like a coach, I'm sure, or management that has to cut a player. That's a difficult thing to do. And those are the hardest parts in my performance side of my job.
No, that's great. Dr. Friesen, thank you so much for being the guest today. I think this was fantastic. And I would keep you all the way through until the evening, but I know you're busy, I'm busy, but thank you again so much for